Some of the presentations expected are from CASAC, SANEF, EFF, SACTU, My Vote Counts and Corruption Watch. The bill is expected to be implemented in time for next year's general election. It envisages that a unit to administer the funding will be established inside the IEC. We now cross live to the NCOP hearings.
Opportunity to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Estelle Grunewald. I'm the Committee Secretary.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Michael Prince. I'm with Parliament's Legal Services.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Buiselo Samuel Shekiso, a researcher of the committee.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I am Mongana Tau, the unit manager in committees.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Arutungwandla, Committee Assistant.
Okay, no, I think we're done now with the introduction. So I'll just make a plea that for those that will be actually making oral submissions or presentations, they will get an opportunity to introduce themselves before they do the presentation. So I'm just going to request that we now proceed with our scheduled agenda for today's meeting. But before we do that, honorable members, I think I must just indicate one thing. In the email that was sent to all the different stakeholders that are supposed to present to us today, I think we did indicate in the email that per presentation, we are requesting that you prepare a presentation for not more than 20 minutes that will be presented to us. Now, as a committee, we also had an opportunity the last week when we sat as a committee, we had an opportunity to also agree on the approach for the public hearing. And there are two issues that I need to indicate, which I think they are of paramount importance to people that will be presenting to take note of. We have agreed that we are going to allocate 30 minutes per presentation. Now, the 30 minutes is actually 15 minutes to be allocated to the presentation itself. And then the 15 minutes will be allocated to the clarity-seeking questions based on the presentation. Because as members of the ad hoc committee, we also had an opportunity to go through some of the presentations. And then we are going again sometime next week as a committee. We are going to get an opportunity to go through the deliberations ourselves as a committee. So we thought we don't have, to prolong the presentations or the public hearing for quite too long, because we are still going to have an opportunity ourselves to deliberate on the presentation. So we'll have to allocate 30 minutes per presentation. If you out of the 30 minutes, if we are going to use 20 minutes, then we'll be left with 10 minutes for clarity-seeking question in your presentation. And if you exceed the 20 minutes mark, then we'll actually request you to take note of the time and all of that. So I think that's the approach that we are going to take moving forward, honorable members. I don't know whether we are in agreement. I can see most of the members are actually in agreement of that particular reality, and that we must actually stick to the approach that we agreed upon. Now, all of us, I think we've got agendas in front of us based on how we are going to proceed. I think we've got eight presentations that we're going to receive. And in the first presentation, it's from the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. It's CASAC. And in that presentation will be done by Professor Richard Calland or either Ms. Mutlati Komote. So we'll now take the opportunity to give over to CASAC to take us through the presentation. I'm not sure whether you will want to present from where you are sitting or you'll be comfortable to come and sit next to us here. If you want to present from there, then that's fine. Okay. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much indeed. I'm very comfortable sitting here. It's a place I've sat before. It feels relatively at home. And the advantage is that one can look directly across at the members of the committee. So with your leave, Chair, I'll remain seated here. Can Can I begin just by introducing myself and my colleagues, the team here from CASAC. For those of you who are not familiar with the organization CASAC, the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, is a public interest NGO that was founded in 2010 with the express purpose and mandate to support the Constitution and the philosophy of progressive constitutionalism that lies, we say, behind the Constitution by acts of litigation, advocacy, and research. And this particular piece of work, which touches on some of the core values that underpin our Constitution, such as responsiveness and transparency and multi-party democracy, is, we say, a very important issue of constitutionalism for the country. And we have therefore committed resources to conducting research, comparative research. We presented Mr. Law, who's sitting next to me, a researcher that was assigned with this task, presented a compendium of comparative research about other acts of Parliament around the world to the National Assembly Committee in order to assist them in considering the options available to South Africa. So I am a member of the Advisory Council of CASAC. It's an advisory council of volunteers such as myself. There are over 40 eminent South African citizens on that council, plus myself, and we serve in order to pursue the mandate of the organization. The reason I'm sitting here, not one of the others, is because this is a subject that has been of very great interest to me for a very long period of time. Indeed, since the late 90s, I have worked on this subject. I used to work for an organization called IDASA, and we conducted a considerable amount of research and litigation on this subject. We never were successful in persuading everybody that this was a matter that should reach the statute book. And so therefore, personally, this is a very, very significant moment in, I think, the country's democratic constitutional journey because it's such an important piece of legislation. I said I was going to, Mr. Chair, introduce the other members of the team. As you mentioned, Madlatsi Komoto, sitting behind me. She's not here to present. She, in fact, is our campaigns officer. So although we have no PowerPoint presentation, and we are doing this entirely old school, she is the new school member of the team because she will be tweeting throughout today's proceedings in order to bring these proceedings and others' perspectives to public light. And then I've mentioned Mr. Law. Mike Law is the researcher that has assisted CASAC during this process, and he's devoted very many long hours and nights during the National Assembly process in order to support not just CASAC, but where possible the committee itself by doing the sort of comparative and other legal research that I mentioned. Finally, I should just apologize on behalf of Mr. Lawson Naidu, who is the Executive Director of CASAC. He has presented on behalf with me before on behalf of CASAC, but he is otherwise engaged today in Durban on a long-standing commitment that he had in Durban, so hence it's in our hands. The first substantive submission, having got those preliminaries out of the way that I wanted to make to the committee, was to applaud the parliamentary process that has proceeded today and which has brought us to this point. Those of us who work in civil society spend a great deal of our time complaining about things, Mr. Chairman, and often that feels like that's all we ever do. So when we get an opportunity to pass favourable comment, and when we get the opportunity to commend an institution such as Parliament for its exemplary conducting of proceedings such as this, then it's an opportunity that we should not let go by. And so I want to say on the record that CASAC has been full of admiration for the way in which the National Assembly ad hoc committee went about its business. As you know, members of the committee, they spent a lot of time on this piece of legislation. There were 2 opportunities to make submissions. Numerous days and nights were spent chewing over the substantive issues that lay behind this work. And the committee and its chairman, Mr. Vincent Smith, Honourable Smith, could not have been more courteous, more open to submissions from the public. And if anybody from anywhere around the world wanted to look at a parliamentary process and say, well, this is exemplary, it's staying loyal to the principle of participatory democracy that underlies the Constitution, then they need look no further than this particular process. That brings me then to my second substantive point, which is really about how this committee, the NCOP committee, should go about its work and perform its responsibility, its mandate on this occasion. You, of course, Mr. Chairman, have full authority to look at this bill and say, well, it's not perfect. It could be improved in certain respects. And I know that some of the people that will be making submissions after me will be trying to persuade you that you should reopen some of the issues of substance that were debated at great length in the National Assembly. I would encourage you, of course, because it's your responsibility to do so, to look very carefully at all of the issues that come before you, to look at every clause of this draft bill. But having said that, I would also invite you, and this is our primary submission, I would also invite you to say, well, this is a bill that advances the principle of transparency and openness and multi-party democracy so far and in such a substantial fashion that in fact it should proceed without amendment. Now, there is perhaps some argument that if one takes the long view of life, and I've had to take the long view over this issue, as I said, I've been working for 20 years on it, and necessarily have had to take the long view. Why the urgency? Well, there is inevitably going to be a general election in the next 12 months or so. That is therefore the campaign season. We think it important that this bill be passed before that campaign season commences. And we think therefore there is a degree of legitimate urgency to ensuring that the passage of this bill proceeds without any undue delay. So we would invite you therefore to take account of that when deciding whether or not to reopen issues of complexity that have already, as I mentioned at least once before, already been the subject of intense discussion, debate, negotiation and research in the National Assembly Committee. That is our opening point. Having said all of that, if, Mr. Chairman, you get to the point at which you decide, well, there are one or two issues, and of course, no piece of legislation is ever perfect. It's very difficult to imagine, especially a piece of legislation such as this, that traverses such difficult territory in many respects, and which tries to deal with what in the literature, the academic literature, says is a wicked problem. And I'm drawing here on my position as an academic at the University of Cape Town to draw upon what I've learned from studying the subject over 20 years, that it is a very difficult topic to legislate effectively over. With that in mind, I set, and Mr. Naidu set Mr. Law a new task in recent days and weeks. We asked him to go back to this bill, look at it as far as possible with fresh eyes, and to redo his comparative study as if this bill that is before you today was already an Act of Parliament, and to answer the question, where would this Act of Parliament, if it was an Act of Parliament, where would it sit in the range of over 100 other countries that have such pieces of legislation? And applying the principles and standards which informed our submission when we first made our first submission to the National Assembly Committee, this bill passes all of the tests that we believe are crucial to having an effective piece of legislation. In fact, Mr. Law's conclusion when he reported back to us was that this draft bill, if it was to become law, would sit probably not just in the top 10, but possibly in the top 3 or 4 pieces of law that have reached the statute book around the world. In other words, this will be a piece of law that this country can be rightly proud of as and when it becomes law. To give you one example of that sophistication with which this legislation approaches this difficult topic, it introduces what has become known as a dual disclosure regime. You'll appreciate, obviously, that every donation, there is a donor and a donee. And that where corruption, as it has unfortunately in this country and in many other countries, where corruption or undue influence arises from that relationship between the donor and the donee, then often it is the responsibility, the culpability for that corruption lies on both parties and not just the recipient political party. That is why we thought it was tremendously important to recognize the shared responsibility that the donor and the donee have in order to introduce an effective regime of governance based on principles of transparency and accountability. That is why, therefore, this dual disclosure regime places a burden on, in particular, corporate donors who are seeking to influence or support the political system, the multi-party democracy of this country. It places a burden upon them to report just as much as it does the recipient political party. That is an extraordinarily advanced, sophisticated, and we would say progressive position to take on this issue. And very few other countries have gone that far. And that is why, and one of the reasons why, if this, as and when this law becomes this bill becomes an act of parliament, it is something that the country will be able to rely on and be very proud of. Two other minor points before I stop talking, Mr. Chairman. Firstly, the establishment of the new multi-party democracy fund is an important institutional innovation, particularly because it will allow donors who wish to remain anonymous to make contributions to multi-party democracy. And I'm mentioning this because I know that at least one of the other submissions this afternoon will seek to persuade you that anonymous donations should not be treated in this way. They should be treated differently. With respect, that misses the point. The point, Mr. Chairman, is this. There are some people out there who not only wish to contribute donations to political parties entirely innocently, entirely out of good faith, entirely not because they want to gain any benefit themselves, but because they want to support the system of multi-party democracy. So modest are they in their desire to make that contribution. They don't even want their identity to be known to those that receive their money. But the problem with anonymous donations is, of course, that they're difficult to govern because by their nature, their inherent nature. What this system would create is a system by which the fund, the multi-party democracy fund, would receive those anonymous donations. Of course, they would not be entirely anonymous because the fund itself, those that run the fund, would know who the donor is. But the political parties that would then benefit from those funds, coming through that fund, would not know the identity. And that would create an entirely arm's-length relationship between the donor and the recipient that we think will benefit political parties because it will bring into the game, it will bring into the funding arena donors who simply do not want their identity known publicly and who are modest enough and humble enough to simply want to make their contributions to support multi-party democracy as a system. Lastly, if you do decide that it is appropriate to amend this bill and put forward amendments that would require the attention once again of the National Assembly, then we would say that the formula, as it's known, the Section 236 formula, the formula for public funding that finds expression through the Act, the Public Funding Act, needs further attention. We think that the proposal of a split between, what's the new split? 2/3 and 1/3, thank you. The new proposed split, 2/3 and 1/3, is a great improvement on the current split of 90 proportional, 10 equitable, which, to be perfectly frank with you, as a constitutional lawyer, I've always thought was unconstitutional, that it cannot have been the intention of the writers of the Constitution in Section 236, where it says that public funding should be on the basis of two principles, equity and proportionality. It cannot have been the Constitutional Assembly's intention that the two principles should be shared out so unevenly, 90% and 10%. Of course, there's silence as to the right proportions, and 2/3, 1/3, we would say is a great improvement. But if it does come to be reopened as a topic, we would advance, as we did in the National Assembly, the proposition that an even split of 50-50 should be the appropriate split. Absolutely, lastly, Mr. Chairman, in the same vein, if you do decide to amend some provisions and send it back to the NA, then we would say that the proposed threshold of 100,000, which is in the regulations attached to the Act, of 100,000 being the figure to trigger disclosure, we think is a little bit on the high side. Of course, size is very much in the eye of the beholder, so to speak, and it does really rather depend who it is that's receiving. So if you're the DA or the ANC, 100,000 might not seem such a large amount. But with respect, if you're a smaller party, 100,000 may, in fact, or 99,000, which would be under the proposed threshold, may in fact be a sizable donation, which could exercise real influence, or it could procure for the donor real influence on that political party. And the whole purpose of this legislation is to ensure that that relationship sees the light of day. And therefore we would say that 50,000 would be a more appropriate figure. But that's a detail, Mr. Chairman. The short point, to conclude where I began, is that this is an excellent piece of legislation that is the product of an excellent parliamentary process, and we would invite you to say, yes, this is a major advance and it should proceed to the statute book without further delay. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much for the presentation from CASAC. We really take note of the presentation. And I like the point which you were actually emphasizing, the relevance of the bill in terms of promoting accountability and also transparency. I think that's actually the objective of the bill, of what the bill seeks to achieve. And also we went further to actually outline the relationship between the donor and the donee, which is actually very much important for me. So we take note of the presentation. So let's now give over and open up to clarity-seeking questions so that we can clarify certain aspects of the presentation if there are any. So I've noted Honorable Labaskagni. Over to you, Honorable Labaskagni. Honorable Chabangu will be the next one.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and thank you very much for the presentation. I just want to ask a few clarity questions. There was an argument previously in the portfolio committee stage that the public was allowed, nobody stops them, to donate or to make donations to the fund that existed previously, but no one made any donations to that fund. The mere fact that we are establishing now a multi-party democracy fund, we're not sure whether people will really make use of this donation, although we think that is the right way to go, and so. Now that brings me to your interpretation and your explanation of the 50-50%, and you used the example of saying when a donor doesn't want to make known that he is donating money to a party, and I understand that. Now I want also to say that very often an organization or an individual is known to the party, and because he is known to the party, because he underscribes the values and principles and what the party stands for, just because of that, that organization or person wants to make a donation to that party. And according to this law now, they can either say, I keep quiet, or I want to disclose, or I don't want to disclose. In the light of that, now we also look at what Section 236 said about equity and proportionality. But I want to raise the question now, because I don't know, where does this fit in? How do we go about the fairness of the freedom of choice of association for the donor? Although we say we want to establish a multi-party democracy, this actually means if we go for the 50-50%, it means if I really underscribe one party's values and principles, 50% of the money that I'm going to give to that party is going to some other parties that I really don't subscribe to. Can you give me some clarity on that point of view? Thank you.
Thanks, Honorable Member, Honorable Chabangu and Honorable Dlamini.
Thank you for the presentation. Part of my question has already been dealt with. But I think transparency should play a crucial role. CASAC says they do not want to gain anything. But I think there is no smoke without fire. And if they donate, I would suggest that, unlike what has been said by the latter speaker, they must donate equally to all parties, even if they are smaller than a party. That is my take. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Honorable Dlamini. I think it will be the last one.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair. Let me welcome the presentation. Thank you very much, Honorable Chair. Let me welcome the presentation. I don't know what I want to say, very progressive. And just one question from my side. I know that we're still going to have an opportunity to get deeper as a committee on these inputs. If we are to promote democracy, definitely small parties don't want to stay small. They will want to grow. What informs, you did explain, but based on what I'm saying to you now, what informs the proposal, should we decide to open it up? What informs the proposal to lower it down to 50 instead of 100? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Dlamini. Let's give to CASAC now to clarify the few issues and then we move forward. Over to you, sir. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Law will deal with the first two questions. I just want to respond immediately to the Honourable Dlamini's question. What informs our suggestion that 100,000 is a bit on the high side? Yet we certainly don't wish to create a chilling effect on any party's ability to raise money. We recognise, and this is something that informs our approach, and I believe is perhaps somewhat distinctive to other organisations' approach. We believe political parties, to flourish, to be successful, need the resources, like any organisation, to be able to be effective. The question is, how do you ensure that the money raised does not offend the principle of transparency, where the public have a right to know and understand the relationship between the donor and the donee? We've had ample experience, unfortunately, in recent years in this country of how secret, illicit, badly intended financial relationships can cause democratic entities to be captured. Let me use the word. And party funding has always, throughout the world, had the potential to enable secret, badly intended donors to capture a political party, and through that to exercise undue, badly intended influence on the political system as a whole and to undermine its integrity. So that's the as us lawyers put it, that's the mischief that this legislation is seeking to address. And the question is whether a 99,000 rand donation to a small party that has a modest budget would offend the principle of transparency and undue influence. And it's very unlikely that a 99,000 rand donation to the ANC or to the DA, which, as I understand it, are parties with bigger budgets than others, it's unlikely that that 99,000 rand donation will buy the donor secret influence over the party. But a smaller party with a more modest budget, it could do. And it's not a perfect science, this. It's a bit of a thumbsuck for Parliament and for us as to what the right figure is. But we just feel that 100,000 is a bit on the high side, and we would, if you open it up again, we would suggest 50,000. Let me hand over to Mr. Law to deal with the first two questions, if I may, because they go to the legislative scheme as a whole, and he understands it certainly better than I do, and probably better than most.
Thank you very much, Honourable Chairperson, Honourable Members. In order to try and answer the first two questions, what I want to do is take a step back and try compartmentalize the bill somewhat, especially the donations aspect. So to do that, we're going to put it into two categories, and the second one's going to have two sort of subcategories. The first is public funding. That's where we get Section 236, and from Section 236 we have what is now, as it still stands, the Public Funding of Represented Political Parties Act. And yes, absolutely, in that act, it does make provision that private donors can donate to that fund, and it gets split also at the moment in the 90-10 manner. And it is true that it's had very, very little support, if any. What's different now? Well, the first difference, or the main difference, is that previously you could donate anonymously directly to political parties. Now you can't do that. So that's where the rationale all of a sudden for this donations to the Multi-Party Democracy Fund comes in, is now they have no alternative. If they want to make an anonymous donation, it has to go to the Multi-Party Democracy Fund. Anyway, I've skipped ahead of myself. So we have the public funding, which is Section 236, and then we have private funding. Now, with private funding, there's two subcategories. There's anonymous donations and donations that are made public. Now, when you want to donate to a political party, you've got a decision to make. Either you are prepared to disclose your identity, and then you can donate directly to a political party. But if you want to keep your anonymity, which we are arguing is not in the spirit of a transparent and accountable constitution, to have undisclosed funders donating to political parties, then you can still donate, but you have a trade-off. Some of your donation is going to go to other parties. So if you want to avoid that, fine, disclose. So we mustn't conflate those three separate areas. Public funding is from the public purse. Private funding is either directly to parties or to the Multi-Party Democracy Fund. Is it a violation of the freedom of expression of the donor, and the privacy of the donor? We've always said that yes, it does infringe that, but the Constitution makes provision that rights can be infringed, and they may also that infringement may be justified applying a basic proportionality test. We have always maintained that the interest of a transparent, accountable South Africa that has for so many years been crippled by corruption or at least secrecy, those interests outweigh the private interest of an individual donor who can still donate to a political party but must either disclose their identity or donate to the Multi-Party Democracy Fund when everyone gets a split. So it's a trade-off. You have to make a decision. If you want to donate anonymously, fine, but you're going to have to donate to everyone as a whole.
No, thank you very much for that clarity. I think now we have actually covered the whole presentation. We are much clearer on the presentation itself. So we are actually taking note of the views or the proposals from CASAC. Like if I understood you correctly, Mr. Lawson, we are actually saying the relationship between the donor and the donee, based on the principle of transparency or the right of the donee and the donor to be infringed. You need to make a choice as a donor whether you want to be known to be supporting a particular party, and if you don't want to be known, you've got also a right to remain and not to fund any political party. I think we actually take note of some of those issues. And then we even went further to actually explain the role between the donor and the donee as it relates to the principle of accountability and also the capturing of some political parties and all of that, you know. So I think we really appreciate it. It was quite comprehensive. So we're much clearer. So we take note, including the fact that you are actually making a proposal to release the 100,000 minimum for declaration to the IEC. You want it to be a bit released. So we actually take note of all those issues that you raised. We'll also have an opportunity as a committee to go through in detail to some of the other issues. And then at a later stage, our position or a view as a committee will be known at a later stage. So thank you very much for that presentation. We now move...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now move over to the next presentation by the South African National Editors Forum, SANEF, and Amabungwane Center for Investigative Journalism. I think it will be done by Ms. Karabo Rajwili and Mr. Isaac Minara. Thank you very much. Over to you. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Honourable Chair and Honourable Members. Thank you for the opportunity. You already stated our name, so we'll jump right in. I'm here on behalf of the South African National Editors Forum. The people on the screen are the people who sent me, and I also convey the greetings of our management committee and Chair Mahlatsi Mahlase. SANEF is a non-profit organization in existence for more than 20 years of editors, senior journalists, journalism trainers, representing the broad South African media, national and community media. We're championing the hard-won freedom of expression legislation, and we also promoting quality, ethics and diversity in the South African media. And we campaign for legislation to enable the media to do their jobs, meaning to do our jobs we need to be able to access information regularly with as much disclosure as possible. So our presentations to the National Assembly and today, it deals mainly with the issues related to the availability of information, and we're not going into the details of how much money and all those kinds of issues. So I'm handing over to Karabo Rajuli to continue, and I'll come back for the second part of the presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Honourable Chair and members. My name is Karabo, and I'm from Amabungane, the Centre for Investigative Journalism, and I'm the advocacy coordinator there. Amabungane was formed in 2009 as an independent non-profit media company to develop investigative journalism in order to build our democracy. So as our name says, we are, I suppose you could call us dirt specialists because we dig up dirt, but not with the intention of being salacious, but so that we can ensure that the accountability gap in our democracy is closed. Our submission is part of our advocacy mandate, which is to ensure that our reporters have got the information which they need in order to undertake the investigative work, but also in the wider public interest. So we want to ensure that the public is able to realize their constitutional right to know. Some of our reporting has led to really important exposés for our democracy, including the work around state capture. And although we are quite small in size, next slide, Although we're quite small in size, of a team of only 11 individuals, our size our reach is much greater than our size, as we publish through different media companies, as well as intervene in a variety of legislative matters. We've intervened in legislation such as the Companies Act to ensure there are adequate transparency provisions for companies, as well as in the Protection of State Information Bill to ensure that journalists would not be unduly harmed by their rights being infringed. We have also, as SANEF and Amabongani, have participated in the National Assembly process, and we, like CASIC, would like to really applaud the work of Parliament in moving to implement what is probably the most important piece of legislation that our democracy will see, given the egregious effect of money in politics, both pre-94 as well as after 94 in our democracy. However, we are making further submissions on clauses which we think will be of importance for the committee to identify and address if we want to create the kind of legislation which will truly fulfill the intentions of this bill, which is to ensure that the public's right to know is not infringed by secret donors giving money to political parties. And there are significant gaps, and so we disagree somewhat with the previous presenters. We make our submissions not only to ensure that reporters are able to do their work and undertake important investigative stories, but also to ensure that the transparency provisions will allow Parliament, as well as the IEC, to undertake its job correctly and with enough compliance and accountability. Our work, as I've said before, and I won't go into too much detail, is informed by the very investigations that we've undertaken. And so we've been able to identify the specific information gaps, which, one, prevent us from being able to report adequately, but more significantly are the places where corruption is most likely to occur. As I've said before, we are dirt specialists. Our submission addresses 4 areas in particular. We look firstly at around the disclosures of the Multi-Party Democracy Fund. We look specifically at one of the gaps from the National Assembly process around donations in kind and the kinds of disclosures that are required there. We also raise concerns which were raised during the National Assembly process around party business ventures not being either prohibited or subject to a disclosure regime. And we also then look at what we think is crucial for this bill, adequate provisions whereby the IEC as well as Parliament will be able to hold political parties to account should they violate any of the provisions in this bill. And we look at how to better strengthen these in the interest of this bill. To go to the first area of concern for us, the Multi-Party Democracy Fund is an important intervention for this bill, which does allow donors an alternative route to give to parties. And while some distance is created between the donor and the political party of choice by having this alternative avenue, the risk still remains because there's simply no possible disclosure mechanism to the public or to the media, who are best placed to be able to report on possible corruption and undue influence. We therefore would say to this committee that it's crucial to have some measure of disclosure around the Multi-Party Democracy Fund to prevent any possible undue influence. For example, a donor at the provincial level saying to a party, I'm willing to contribute to this fund, knowing full well that some of the donation will go to other political parties. However, their party of choice will still benefit from this Multi-Party Democracy Fund through the current distribution and allocation of funding in the current regulations. Because of this risk, we say that there should be an amendment, if you could go to the next slide, which both allows some level of anonymity for lower threshold donations, but then donations over above prescribed threshold must be disclosed by the IEC to Parliament as well as to the public to, again, prevent this possible undue influence of private donors using this as an alternative mechanism to capture their party of choice. Our next submission is on public donations, on the disclosures of donations in kind. Whilst this is not a monetary donation to a political party, donations in kind may be things such as voluntary accounting services, management fees, public relations services, and the quantity, the value, the monetary value of this can be significant for a political party and their ability to influence an election and yield power. The unintended consequence of this, the donations in kind not being subject to any kind of public disclosure regime, can be that a donor may choose to use this non-monetary way of contributing to a political party to hide their hand of undue influence to any political party of their choice. We therefore recommend that the NCOP take seriously the clause that we've inserted, if you could go to the next slide, around donations in kind, to include in the definition section of this current bill a clause which will allow donations in kind to be disclosed, and again, donations in kind, not all of them, to release the administrative burden, but those donations in kind, so these management fees, public relations services and so forth, above a particular value. Now, the committee will need to sit and decide what that particular value needs to be and how to determine this. But again, this will be crucial if we're wanting to have a piece of legislation which really fulfills the intention of this bill and act. Our third submission relates to the enforcement capacity of this particular piece of legislation. And this is crucial because should the IEC needs to be given sufficient teeth and able to hold political parties to account. We've identified very specific gaps which were raised in the National Assembly process, and we raise again here as areas of concern. The first relates to if you could go to where the drafting recommendations are. Okay, Isaac will get there. I'll just go ahead and talk. Firstly, in relation to clause 10.3, the prohibition on circumventing the provisions of the bill says that it only relates to that particular chapter. Now, should the committee agree with our submissions around, in particular, the Multi-Party Democracy Fund and the requirement to disclose for this particular section, the prohibition and circumvention clauses will need to apply not only to Chapter 3 of this bill, but to the bill in its entirety to ensure that all aspects of this bill are able to be enforced adequately by the IEC. We also, and this comes directly from our work as an investigative journalism unit, but also as a media in general, are concerned that there isn't a sufficient definition of donations or contributions coming from the same source or substantially related sources. So in this scenario, it may be a company or an individual who, to hide their wanting to influence a particular party, bring on board various partners, bring on board various family members, and they individually provide money to a particular party, knowing that the totality of their contribution will be used to yield influence over that particular party. So we would strongly recommend that some kind of definition, and we do provide a full definition in our longer submission, on what constitutes a substantially relates, what constitutes substantially related sources for an individual, for a donor, to ensure that this kind of undue influence isn't exerted. Our last submission related to circumvention is, if you could go to, okay. Okay, so in the bill as it currently stands, reporting to the IEC is only above a particular threshold. We would strongly recommend that the IEC is given, again, more teeth in this matter. So not only are donations which are above a particular threshold being reported to the IEC, but the IEC should be given by political parties all information related to all donors, even below a prescribed threshold, to ensure the IEC is adequately informed to be able to identify possible compromised donations to political parties. So essentially what we're saying is that the public can be given information about donations above a certain threshold, but the IEC should be given full information about all monies political parties are receiving from direct donors. Our last submission before I hand over to Isak is related to disclosure of political parties' investment arms and investment funds. Now, we know from a lot of the reporting that has come from media companies that this has been a key area where we've seen the undue influence of money in politics, and parties using a party using its investment arm to bolster its own coffers during an election period. The bill is completely silent on this matter. We would make two recommendations, and this is for the committee and honourable members to decide, that either parties' investment arms should either be prohibited in totality, and if that's not possible because political parties do need to secure these funds for their work, then there should be a public disclosure regime around any monies that parties are able to draw as a result of their investment arms or dividends which they draw through companies which they may have shares or ownership in. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. In the second part of the presentation, we want to draw your attention to a new set of guidelines that was launched by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights just about 6 weeks ago at their meeting. So these guidelines were not available when we made our initial submissions to the National Assembly, and it has just become available, and we managed.
You're watching SABC News. Now, that was a live crossing to the NCOP sitting, which is busy with its public hearings on the political party funding bill. Now, this bill was passed by the National Assembly recently and sent to the NCOP for concurrence.